So how do you put a country back together after it's been torn apart by conflict? It's one of the toughest questions out there. And for decades, there's been this one big idea that's really dominated how peace builders think. It promised a modern, flexible way to create stable governments. But what if that whole promise was built on a really shaky foundation? In this explainer, we're going to dig into why the most popular model for building peace might just be based on a fundamental misunderstanding.
Right. This is the core challenge. When a country is split right down the middle, maybe along ethnic or religious lines, a simple winner-takes-all democracy just isn't going to work. It can feel like a recipe for disaster for the minority groups. So, political scientists came up with a very specific tool for these kinds of situations. And that tool is called consociationalism. It's a bit of a mouthful, I know, but the main idea is to get away from simple majority rule and instead build a system where all the major groups actually share power. You can think of it like a government by committee, where everybody gets a seat at the table. It's got these key features, like grand coalitions with all the big groups, a certain amount of autonomy for those groups to run their own affairs, and, this is crucial, mutual vetoes, so no single group can just steamroll the others. Now, for years and years, the thinking has been that this idea comes in two flavors, a good one and a bad one. On the one hand, you've got liberal consociation. This one gets all the praise for being flexible and open. It doesn't actually name any ethnic groups in the law. Instead, the groups just sort of define themselves through elections. It's seen as the best way to protect individual rights. But on the other side, you have corporate consociation. This one's often criticized for being rigid because it literally writes the groups into the Constitution, essentially locking those identities in place. And the conventional wisdom has always been pretty clear. Liberal is the modern, better way to go.
But here's where it gets interesting. A really important paper comes along and basically turns this entire idea on its head. It argues that this nice, neat distinction between good, liberal, and bad corporate systems isn't just wrong, it's actively misleading. It calls the promise of a truly liberal power-sharing system a false one. And to really get why, we need to talk about something called the boomerang effect.
So the boomerang effect, it's what happens when you take a theory and you stretch it to fit situations it was never, ever designed for. A scholar might take a concept, apply it incorrectly to a new case, and then, because it doesn't fit well, they wrongly conclude that the original theory itself is flawed. The source material for this explainer argues this is exactly what happened with consociationalism, and it led to this totally artificial split between liberal and corporate models.
Let's just take a second to look at what these so-called liberal systems are supposed to do. I mean, on paper they sound amazing, right? Proponents say they avoid discriminating against any one group, they're flexible and can adapt as society changes, they're way better at protecting individual rights, and they might even help weaken those ethnic divisions over time. It's a really, really appealing picture.
But, and you probably saw this coming, when we actually look past the theory and at the evidence on the ground, well, the story gets a lot more complicated. That beautiful picture starts to fall apart.
A huge review in 2023 looked at 50 years of literature on power sharing, and it found something pretty surprising. The systems that were labeled corporate or hybrid, the supposedly bad ones, actually reported more positive effects than the supposedly superior liberal ones. Take Northern Ireland, a hybrid system. Researchers there counted 50 positive effects versus only 4 negative ones. Wow. Meanwhile, the poster children for the liberal model, places like Iraq and Afghanistan, they showed very, very few positive effects at all.
Okay, so if the evidence doesn't really back up the theory, what's actually happening here? How are these supposedly group-neutral, liberal systems really put together? And this gets us right to the very heart of the critique.
This quote from the source just nails it. A corporate system is totally upfront about what it's doing. It's about names and numbers. It explicitly says which groups get what power. But a liberal system? It just hides the names. It's about the names behind the numbers. You see, the group-based design is still there. It's just cleverly disguised.
Let's look at a real-world example from Iraq's constitution. It shows exactly how this works. Okay. Step 1. The formal rule looks perfectly liberal. It says you can veto a constitutional change if 2/3 of voters in any 3 provinces vote no. See? No ethnic groups are mentioned. But then, step 2, the reality on the ground. The Kurdish region is made up of, you guessed it, exactly 3 provinces. And that leads to step 3, the hidden veto. This rule, which looks totally neutral, was intentionally designed to give the Kurdish minority an ironclad veto to protect their interests. It's group-based politics, just without saying the names out loud.
And this is the hidden truth, the real takeaway. All of these power-sharing systems are, at their core, about managing groups. The whole liberal versus corporate thing, it's not about one being for individuals and the other for groups. Nope. It's just about whether the system is honest and explicit about its group-based mechanics. The liberal label is really just a veneer.
This brings up a really important point. A country that uses a consociational system, like Switzerland or Belgium, can absolutely be a stable, functioning liberal democracy, with rule of law, free elections, the whole deal. But the theory of consociationalism is not the same thing as the political theory of liberalism. Liberalism, as a philosophy, is all about the individual. But consociationalism, by its very design, is centered on the group. The two logics are actually pulling in different directions.
So where do we go from here? Well, the paper suggests a much more honest approach. First off, let's just stop using these misleading terms liberal and corporate. Instead, we should probably go back to the original, more neutral language from the political scientist Aaron Liphart, self-determination versus predetermination of groups. It's just about how the groups are identified. Second, we have to stop treating the supposed benefits of one design over the other as proven facts. They're not. They're hypotheses that need to be tested with real evidence. And finally, let's just accept that this kind of politics is, at the end of the day, group-based.
And that brings us to the final, really tough question at the heart of this whole debate. Even if we're honest about how these systems work, we're still left with this fundamental trade-off. To stop people from fighting each other, do you have to carve their divisions into the very fabric of the state? Is building a negative peace just the absence of war? Is it worth the price of maybe hardening the very group identities that caused the conflict in the first place? That's the huge dilemma that peace builders are still grappling with today.